Single dad was tricked into a Christmas blind date. What she said left him in tears. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Snow fell soft and steady on the streets of Denver that Christmas Eve, blanketing everything in white while twinkling lights wrapped around lampposts and carolers sang on street corners like something out of a holiday movie. Hollybrook Cafe sat on the corner of Pine and Third, with its windows glowing golden against the winter dark. And inside, families laughed over hot chocolate, while couples held hands across candlelit tables celebrating the magic of the season. Wyatt Brennan sat alone at a corner table staring at a single red rose in a slim vase and wondering for the 100th time why he'd let his sister talk him into this disaster of an evening. Claire had called with that voice she used when she wasn't taking no for an answer and said he needed to be here at 7 o'clock because it was life or death important. And like an idiot, he'd believed her. He ordered black coffee and checked his phone every 30 seconds, hoping maybe this mystery woman would cancel so he could go home and pretend he'd tried. The door opened and cold air rushed in along with a woman in a powered wheelchair, auburn hair braided over one shoulder, and green eyes scanning the room like she was looking for an exit rather than a date. She was beautiful in a way that made Wyatt's chest tighten, but before he could fully register that thought, he watched something in her face absolutely shatter. Her eyes had landed on him, on the rose, on the fact that he was standing when he'd noticed her, and she started shaking her head like she'd just received the worst news of her life. "No," she whispered, and tears were already forming. "No, no, no." She was backing up her wheelchair, gripping the wheels so tight her knuckles went white, her chest heaving with panic. "Please," her voice cracked completely. "Please just go. Save us both the embarrassment." Wyatt stood frozen because he had no idea what was happening, why this stranger was crying in the doorway of a cafe on Christmas Eve, why she was begging him to leave before they'd even exchanged names. People at nearby tables were starting to stare, and conversations were quieting, and she was falling apart right in front of him. "I can't do this again," she was saying through tears. The awkward politeness, the forced conversation, the relief on their face when it's finally over. "I've been through this too many times. Please just go before this gets worse." Every instinct Wyatt had said to help. He walked toward her slowly, carefully, and then did something that surprised even himself. He pulled out a chair and sat down right there in the middle of the cafe, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers. "Hey," he said gently, "I'm Wyatt. Can I sit with you? Only if you want." She stared at him like he'd spoken another language. "You're not leaving?" Her voice was raw and wounded and waiting for the blow she was certain was coming. "Do you want me to?" A long pause. Her hands trembled on her wheels. "I don't know," she admitted, and somehow that honesty cut through everything. "Then let's figure it out together," Wyatt said, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. "What's your name?" "Noel." She wiped her face with shaking hands. "They told me you used a wheelchair too. They said you'd understand, that you wouldn't look at me like I'm broken. And you're standing there perfectly fine, and I'm crying like an idiot in front of the whole restaurant." Wyatt felt anger flare in his chest, not at her, but at whoever had lied to get her here. "My sister set this up," he said. "She never mentioned anything about a wheelchair. She just told me you were extraordinary, and I needed to meet you." Noel laughed bitterly. "Extraordinary, right. That's what they always say before they realize I'm too complicated and make some excuse about an early morning." "Can I be honest with you?" Wyatt waited until she nodded. "I don't know what you've been through, but I know what it feels like to be set up by people who think they know what you need. I know what it feels like to be managed instead of respected. And I know what it feels like to be so tired of pity that you'd rather be alone forever than face one more sympathetic smile." Her eyes searched his face. "How would you know any of that?" "Because I've been canceling blind dates for 2 years. Because everyone I know thinks they can fix me if they just find the right person. Because I only came tonight to get my sister off my back." Something shifted in Noelle's expression, the smallest crack in the wall she'd built. "Why would you need fixing?" Wyatt took a breath. "My wife died 2 years ago, 2 days before Christmas, drunk driver ran a red light while she was picking up our daughter from school. I was supposed to do it, but I was stuck in a meeting I thought was more important. The words hung between them, heavy and real. Noelle's tears had stopped falling, but her eyes glistened with fresh ones, different ones, tears of recognition instead of humiliation. I was 15 minutes late to the hospital, Wyatt continued quietly. She was already gone, and I've spent every day since then wondering if those 15 minutes could have saved her. Noelle was silent for a long moment. Then she said just as quietly, 3 years ago, I was an interior designer with my own firm. I was engaged to a man I thought was my forever. Then a drunk driver ran a red light and hit my car. Wyatt felt his chest tighten at the parallel. I woke up in a hospital unable to feel my legs, Noelle continued. My fiancé Jordan stayed for 4 months, visited every day, said all the right things. Then one morning he sat on my hospital bed and told me he loved me, but couldn't handle this. He said he'd signed up for a different life, a different woman. Her voice cracked. He left me in a rehabilitation center, barely able to dress myself, and walked out like I was a problem he'd finally solved. Wyatt didn't try to fill the silence with empty comfort. He just sat there, present, listening, giving her space to say what she needed to say. I rebuilt everything, Noelle said. My career, my independence, my whole life. But dating is a nightmare. Every blind date ends the same way. They see the wheelchair, they make an excuse, they leave. I can't survive being someone's charity case again. You're not a charity case, Wyatt said firmly. You're someone who survived something terrible and rebuilt your entire life. That's not broken, that's incredibly strong. She looked at him like no one had ever said that before. You really believe that? I believe that we both got ambushed by people who love us but lied to us. I believe we both understand what it's like to have everything change in one moment. And I believe that since we're both here, we might as well get coffee out of it. The smallest smile tugged at Noelle's lips. You're not going to run? I'm not going to run. I'm not going to pretend to be interested for an hour and disappear. I'm just going to sit here with you and see what happens. No expectations, no pressure, no pity. Noelle studied him for a long moment, searching for the lie. She didn't find one. Okay, she finally whispered. Okay. Mrs. Whitmore appeared with menus and a knowing smile, and Wyatt helped Noelle navigate to their table by the window, where the Christmas lights reflected off the snow outside. They ordered tea and then hot chocolate, and talked until the cafe started emptying around them. And somewhere between the cookies and the conversation, two people who had every reason to run found every reason to stay. They talked until Mrs. Whitmore had to physically shoo them toward the door because she had grandchildren waiting at home and a turkey that wasn't going to cook itself. And even then, Wyatt found himself lingering on the snowy sidewalk outside the cafe, not wanting the night to end. Noelle sat in her wheelchair wrapped in her winter coat with snowflakes catching in her auburn hair, and she looked up at him with eyes that had stopped expecting disappointment for the first time all evening. This wasn't what I expected tonight, she said softly, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. I expected to cry and go home and eat ice cream alone while watching terrible Christmas movies. Wyatt smiled. I expected to sit through an awkward hour and then text my sister that I tried and it didn't work out. He paused. I'm really glad I was wrong. Noelle laughed, and the sound was genuine in a way that made his chest feel lighter than it had in years. Me too. She hesitated like she was about to say something else, but wasn't sure if she should, and Wyatt waited because he was learning that she needed space to find her words. Thank you for staying. Most people would have run after that scene I made. Most people don't know what it's like to be ambushed by well-meaning family members who think they know best. Wyatt pulled out his phone. Can I get your number? I'd really like to do this again. Without the crying in the doorway part, preferably. She laughed again and gave him her number, and when he texted her a simple, "This is Wyatt, the guy who didn't run," she smiled at her phone like he'd sent her flowers instead of 7 words. He watched her navigate to her adapted van and load herself in with practiced ease, and something about the competence and independence of it made him respect her even more. The days after Christmas were filled with texts that started casual and quickly became the thing Wyatt looked forward to most in his day. He sent her pictures of his daughter Ellie's messy Christmas morning, unwrapping presents with wrapping paper flying everywhere. And Noelle sent back pictures of her apartment decorated for New Year's, with accessible touches he wouldn't have noticed before. They talked on the phone late at night after Ellie was asleep. Conversations that stretched for hours about nothing and everything, about grief and healing, and the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who didn't really see you. Their first real date was at an accessible art museum where Noelle gave him a tour of her favorite paintings and explained composition and color theory with such passion that Wyatt found himself seeing art in completely new ways. Their second date was dinner at a restaurant she'd vetted beforehand, one with wide aisles and accessible bathrooms and staff who didn't treat her wheelchair like a fascinating curiosity. Their third date was a cooking class at Wyatt's apartment where they made an absolute disaster of everything and laughed until their stomachs hurt. "This is the most fun I've had in years," Noelle admitted, flour dusted across her cheek from their failed attempt at homemade pasta. "Even though our dinner looks like abstract art." "Especially because our dinner looks like abstract art," Wyatt corrected. And when he leaned over to wipe the flour from her cheek, their faces ended up much closer than he'd planned, and neither of them pulled away for a long moment. 3 months into whatever this was becoming, Wyatt knew it was time for Noel to meet Ellie. His daughter was his entire world, and if this relationship was going to go anywhere real, Ellie needed to be part of it. But he was terrified in a way he hadn't been about anything since Lily died, because if Ellie didn't connect with Noel, then he'd have to end something that was starting to feel like hope. He invited Noel over on a Saturday afternoon and spent the entire morning stress cleaning the apartment, while Ellie asked approximately 1 million questions about who was coming and why Daddy was acting so weird. When the doorbell rang, Ellie ran to answer it before Wyatt could stop her, and he watched his 7-year-old daughter stare openly at Noel's wheelchair with the kind of unfiltered curiosity only children possess. "How come you have special wheels?" Ellie asked immediately, because subtlety was not in her vocabulary. Noelle smiled and Wyatt could see she wasn't offended, just amused. "My legs got hurt in an accident, so now I use these wheels to get around instead of walking." Ellie thought about this very seriously. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes, but I've gotten pretty good at dealing with it." "Can you do tricks?" Ellie's eyes were huge with hope. Noelle grinned in a way that made Wyatt's heart flip. "Want to see?" She did a perfect spin right there in the doorway, and Ellie screamed with delight like she'd just witnessed actual magic. And from that moment on, Wyatt's daughter was completely smitten. They spent the afternoon baking cookies together, Noelle supervising from counter height, while Ellie did the messy parts and got chocolate chips everywhere, including somehow in her hair. Noelle listened to Ellie's chatter about school and her friends, and her hamster named Mr. Whiskers. Like every word was the most important thing she'd ever heard. And Wyatt stood in the doorway watching two of his favorite people bond and felt something crack open in his chest. Later, after Noelle had gone home and Ellie was supposed to be getting ready for bed, his daughter tugged on his sleeve with a very serious expression. "Daddy," she whispered like she was sharing classified information. "Miss Noelle is the coolest person ever. Can we keep her?" Wyatt laughed, but his eyes were suspiciously wet. "We'll see, sweetheart. We'll see." Everything was going too well, and Noelle knew it because good things in her life had a habit of falling apart right when she started believing in them. She started noticing things she'd trained herself to ignore: strangers staring when she and Wyatt were out together, restaurants that weren't fully accessible despite claiming to be, moments when Wyatt had to help her with something she used to do alone. The voice in her head that sounded like Jordan started whispering again, telling her she was too much work, too complicated, too broken. One evening they were at a restaurant, and a woman at the next table whispered loudly to her companion, "What's he doing with her?" And Noelle pretended she hadn't heard, even though the words burned like acid. Wyatt definitely heard because his jaw tightened, and he looked ready to say something. But Noelle shook her head slightly and changed the subject, and spent the rest of dinner feeling like she was taking up space she hadn't earned. She started pulling back without meaning to, taking longer to respond to texts and canceling plans, with excuses about work being busy and creating distance where there had been closeness. Some part of her was waiting for Wyatt to realize she was too difficult and leave, and another part was trying to leave first so it would hurt less when it inevitably fell apart. Ellie noticed before Wyatt did, because children see everything adults try to hide. Daddy, where's Miss Noel? She hasn't been here forever. Her little face was crumpled with worry. She's busy, sweetheart. Work stuff. Ellie looked at him with eyes that were too wise for 7 years old. Is she going to leave like Mommy did? The question hit Wyatt like a physical blow. Everyone leaves, right, Daddy? That's what happens. He pulled his daughter close and held her tight while his mind raced. Noel was pulling away, and his little girl was already bracing for another loss, and he refused to let either of them give up without a fight. He showed up at Noel's apartment unannounced on a Tuesday evening, and she opened the door looking tired and red-eyed, clearly surprised to see him. Wyatt, I wasn't expecting... What happened? He interrupted gently but firmly. What did I do wrong? You didn't do anything. Then why are you running? Noel wheeled backward into her apartment and he followed, closing the door behind him. The silence stretched until she finally spoke. It's been 3 months. Jordan left at 4. Understanding crashed over Wyatt like cold water. You're waiting for me to leave. I'm waiting for you to realize I'm too much, too complicated, too broken. Her voice cracked. And I'd rather leave first than watch you figure it out. Wyatt crossed the room and knelt in front of her wheelchair so they were eye to eye, the same way he had in the cafe that first night. I'm not Jordan. I'm not going to leave because things get hard. You don't know that. You're right. But I can promise to try every single day. He took her hands in his. My daughter asked me tonight if you were going to leave like her mommy did. She said everyone leaves, that's just what happens. And I had to look at my 7-year-old and not have an answer for her. Noel's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to. She already loves you, Wyatt continued. And so do I. I didn't think I'd ever say that again. But here I am, saying it to a woman I met because my sister tricked us both into the world's most disastrous blind date. Noel laughed through her tears. You love me? I love you, not despite the wheelchair, not because of it. I love you because you're brilliant and funny and brave, and you survived something terrible and came out stronger. I love you because you taught my daughter that different doesn't mean less. I love you because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be alive, instead of just surviving. She was crying freely now, but these were different tears than the ones in the cafe doorway. These were the tears of someone who'd stopped believing in good things and was suddenly faced with something wonderful. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Wyatt admitted, but I'm more scared of losing you than I am of trying. He kissed her then, soft and slow and certain, and she kissed him back with everything she'd been holding inside since Christmas Eve. When they finally pulled apart, they were both crying and both laughing, and the walls that had been between them were finally starting to crumble. Stay, she whispered. Please. Always, he promised, and he meant it. The months that followed were the happiest Wyatt could remember since before Lily died, filled with family dinners and movie nights, and his daughter falling asleep on Noel's lap like she'd been doing it her whole life. They settled into a rhythm that felt natural and easy. Noel helping Ellie with homework and teaching her about design and color. Wyatt learning to navigate the world differently because he wanted to understand every part of the woman he loved. Ellie started calling her Miss Noel, and then just Noel. And then one afternoon she accidentally said, Mom, and immediately clapped her hand over her mouth like she'd committed a crime. Noel's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Ellie close and whispered that it was okay, that she would be honored to be whatever Ellie needed her to be, and Wyatt had to leave the room because he couldn't let them see him completely fall apart. His sister Claire called every week to check in and say, I told you so, in increasingly creative ways, and even though Wyatt pretended to be annoyed, he was secretly grateful she'd tricked them both into that cafe on Christmas Eve. Sometimes the people who loved you knew what you needed before you did, even if their methods were questionable at best. Summer turned to fall, and fall crept toward winter, and Wyatt realized with a jolt that the anniversary was approaching. 2 years and 10 months since Lily died. 2 days before Christmas, just like always. He got quieter as the date approached, the old grief rising up even though he'd found new joy. And Noel noticed because she noticed everything about him. She showed up at his door on the anniversary morning, holding flowers and looking uncertain. I thought you might not want to be alone today, she said softly, But if you need space, I understand. I can go. Wyatt pulled her inside and held her for a long moment before he could speak. Stay, please. They went to the cemetery together, all three of them, Wyatt pushing Ellie's hand into Noel's as they walked across the frozen grass. Noel hung back at first, giving them space, but Ellie ran back and grabbed her arm and said, Come meet Mommy. She would have liked you so much. And Noel found herself being pulled toward a headstone she'd only heard about. Mommy, this is Noel, Ellie announced to the grave with the matter-of-fact confidence of a 7-year-old who fully believed her mother could hear her. She makes Daddy smile again. He doesn't look sad all the time anymore. And she taught me how to do wheelchair tricks, which is really cool, even though Daddy says we're going to give him a heart attack. Noelle was crying freely now, tears freezing on her cheeks in the December air. Wyatt knelt beside the headstone and touched the cold stone gently. Lily, I found someone. I think you sent her to us. I think you knew we needed her. They stayed until the cold became too much. 3 people connected by love and loss, and the strange, beautiful way life moves forward, even when you think it can't. On the drive home, Ellie fell asleep in the back seat, and Noelle reached over to take Wyatt's hand without saying a word. Christmas Eve arrived exactly 1 year after their disastrous first meeting, and Wyatt told Noelle he was taking her somewhere special without giving any other details. She protested that she hated surprises, but he just smiled mysteriously and loaded her into his truck with Ellie bouncing excitedly in the back seat like she knew something Noelle didn't. They pulled up to Hollybrook Cafe, and Noelle's breath caught because the windows were glowing with the same golden light, the same Christmas decorations, the same magic that had been there the night her life changed forever. You brought me back here, she whispered. I wanted to come full circle, Wyatt said. This is where I met the woman who saved me. Mrs. Whitmore greeted them at the door with tears already forming because she'd been in on the secret for weeks. She led them to the same corner table with the same red rose in the slim vase. And Noelle looked around at this place where she'd once broken down crying and begged a stranger to leave before he could reject her. They ordered the same tea and hot chocolate they'd had that first night, and Ellie was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement across the table. Wyatt's hands were shaking slightly, and Noelle noticed because she noticed everything about him, and her heart started beating faster. 1 year ago, Wyatt said, reaching across to take her hands, I walked into this cafe expecting another awkward blind date I'd have to survive. I was tired and broken and convinced I'd never feel anything again. Noelle's eyes were already filling with tears. Wyatt, and then you rolled through that door crying and begging me to leave, and something in my chest woke up for the first time in 2 years. I saw someone brave and strong and beautiful, someone who'd been hurt too many times but still showed up anyway. He let go of her hands and stood up, and then he did the thing that made the entire cafe go silent. He got down on one knee right there beside her wheelchair, the same way he'd done that first night when he'd refused to leave. You taught me that survival isn't the same as living, he said, his voice breaking. You taught Ellie that different doesn't mean less. You taught me how to hope again when I'd forgotten hope existed. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring that sparkled in the Christmas lights. I'm not asking you to complete me because you've shown me that's not how this works. I'm asking you to build something new with me and Ellie, a family, a future, all of it. Noelle was sobbing now, her whole body shaking, and the cafe was so quiet you could hear the snow falling outside. Noelle Carter, Wyatt said with tears streaming down his own face. Will you marry me? Yes, she managed through her tears. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. The cafe erupted in applause as Wyatt slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss. Mrs. Whitmore was crying into her apron, strangers at other tables were cheering, and Ellie launched herself at both of them, screaming, She said yes! I get a mom! Daddy, I get a mom! They got married the following summer in an accessible garden venue, with fairy lights strung between the trees, and Ellie serving as the most enthusiastic flower girl anyone had ever seen. Claire and Marin stood as bridesmaids, finally forgiven for the lies that had brought everyone together. Mrs. Whitmore catered the whole thing herself because she refused to let anyone else feed her kids on their wedding day. Wyatt's vows made everyone cry, including himself. You taught me that life after loss is still life worth living. I choose you today and every day for the rest of our lives. Noel's vows broke what was left of everyone's composure. You stayed when everyone else left. You saw me at my absolute worst and chose to sit down anyway. I promise to spend every day being worthy of that choice. Christmas Eve 2 years later found them decorating a tree in their new accessible home, with Ellie directing ornament placement like a tiny general. Noelle was very pregnant, and Wyatt couldn't stop hovering, bringing her water and pillows and asking if she was comfortable every 3 minutes, until she threatened to throw tinsel at him. "When's my baby brother coming?" Ellie asked for approximately the 100th time that week. "Soon, sweetheart," Noelle laughed. "Very soon." Wyatt sat down beside his wife and wrapped his arm around her, watching their daughter hang ornaments while snow fell outside and Christmas music played softly. "Hey," Noelle said, leaning into him. "You okay?" "Better than okay," Wyatt said. "I'm home." Sometimes the dates you try to avoid become the moments that change everything. Wyatt walked into that cafe expecting another failure and found the love of his life instead. Noelle wheeled through that door expecting rejection and found a man who refused to leave. What she said that night about being abandoned and broken and too scared to hope, those words didn't push him away. They made him stay. If this story reminded you that broken doesn't mean unworthy and that second chances are real, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to believe their story isn't over. And remember, next time someone begs you to leave, maybe that's exactly when they need you to stay. Merry Christmas and thank you for being